So we're going to get just started here in just a minute. We'd ask that you fill out the cards. We're collecting them, and the way it's going to work is we'll pick the questions that you've filled out. We'll try and hit as many questions as we can. Just keep in mind, this is slated to go for an hour. So the faster that you ask your question when you're called to the podium, the more questions we get to this evening. And you just come up and hold the mic, and you can ask your question of the congressman. So we'll get started here in a minute, and we thank everybody for coming out tonight.
Thank you for being here. See you in the paper sometimes. Thank you for being here. Hello. How are you? Thank you, sir, for being here. How are you? Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to be here. How are you, miss? Thank you for being here. What's that? I won't ask it. I've had a lot of those. So. Hello. Thank you for being here. Hey. How are you? You made the trek up. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Can I be heard okay? Everybody can hear what I have to say? No? So how does this mic work? Well, can you increase the volume? That should, now we can hear me better, right? Great. Thank you for being here this evening. This is probably, I think, my fourth town hall over the summer months. And I think it's a good way for you to get to ask me what you would like. In the operation of now 3 town halls, we're developing what I think is probably the most efficient way to get to as many questions, and even more than questions, more subject areas than anything else, because sometimes we found like the same kind of question gets asked, and then later on, the same kind of question gets asked. So I want to make sure we get to as many as possible. People have written questions out, right? To some, right, and there'll be more, and that's fine. So while they're sort of figuring out what questions we should go with first, you have a couple to go?
Yeah, we got plenty of questions.
All right, well then, so we'll go for however an hour, 15 minutes, hour and a half. Ask me whatever you'd like, and I'll give you as good of an answer as I can muster up. The focus of this, hopefully, is as much on legislative stuff than anything else. I know I'm going to get asked about President Trump. I know I'm going to get asked about what he said or what he tweeted. That's fine. But I also want to make sure that we're talking about tax reform and where we are on health care reform and what happened or what may happen relative to North Korea or in the Middle East or workforce development programming or immigration or anything else. So I don't mean to be dismissive of the questions I know I'm going to get. I just want to make sure that we also talk about a lot of other stuff along the way, because this will not just be a town hall for us here, but I believe somebody's taping it, so we will put it up online. Just as we've put my Berks County Town Hall, it's online. If you want to see 2 hours, if you want to go to sleep at night and you're bored, you can put up my Berks County Town Hall, my Pottstown Town Hall, Ida Westchester Town Hall. There's about 8 to 10 hours worth of good filming. We have somebody right here filming as well. How are you doing? So with that all said, who will ask the first question? And who is filming tonight? Who do we have filming?
Catherine's out in the hall. She contract, but JKM Productions.
Very good. So
I think I read that letter.
We have JKM Productions filming tonight. So we'd ask anybody else filming to rely on JKM videotaping for purposes of moving forward for filming. Very good. What's your name? Aubrey. Thanks for being here. So with that, who do we have?
We have John Harvey from Lebanon.
John, if you'd like to come up and ask your question, you're free to do that. Vietnam veteran, SEIU, thank you for being here and your service.
And I did read your statement, but I'd like to hear this from you personally. What do you think of the president's 3 statements about the terrorist acts in Charlottesville last week? And what do you think about the events of last week in Virginia.
Very good. Did we have printouts of those statements, Corey?
Yes, they should have been handed out.
Good, and I will respond. I just want to make sure everybody has. I prepared a couple things. I did a WFMZ interview yesterday where I dealt directly with what I thought was the failure of presidential leadership to just speak clearly about what happened. Right? This was an incident where someone drove a car into someone and killed someone, and it was a white supremacist who did it, and it was a young woman who's dead, and there's 19 others injured. And that's what should be said. It's not, we do not live in a country that should equivocate or marginalize or draw equivalencies between forms of hate. And I have an op-ed which I did provide to the Lebanon Daily News. It is online right now if you want to see it in a couple newspaper websites. Look, I think that we are in a very toxic political environment right now. I think that there is a lot of anger out there. I am concerned that that kind of hateful rhetoric is spreading. And I think for the safety of all of us, I think for the character of our country, I think for what we should be trying to teach our children about opportunity and what it means to be free and the sacrifices that so many people have made throughout the history of our country to allow us to inherit all the great that this country has to offer, that when we get into the sort of discussion that results from what happened in Charlottesville, the worst thing that we can do is start trying to politicize it. And your question was in no way intended to politicize it. Your question was asking me what I think about it. But I see people in this country looking to politicize that. And I think it is very wrong. I think that there is nothing productive about that. And I think it's important for all of us to find clarity and wisdom about this situation from whomever we need to find that wisdom and that clarity. Because it didn't come where it usually comes from, which is the President of the United States. That's what I think. Next question.
Does anybody have a follow-up before we move on?
Sure.
Because we're going to try and...
Yeah, let's do Charlottesville for once.
Charlottesville. And
Go ahead, sir.
you want to come on up?
Just your name, where you live, and the follow-up.
My name's Steve Knepp from Schaeferstown. I just moved back into your district from 3 years in New Mexico.
Very good.
I've written and asked for a one-on-one with you, but I
You'll get
realize
it.
it's only 2 months.
How long ago?
About 6-7 weeks. I disagree with whatever people are saying about President Trump's statement. I watched a news clip today where over his campaign at least 13 times he denounced the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, David Duke, the KKK. How many times does he have to renounce them is what I have to say. That's my question. I think he did the right thing by not saying as much as he did at first. He said, I need to gather the facts. I shot off my mouth before my brains were loaded plenty of times in my life.
Me too.
And
Yeah.
I'm just fed up with everybody bashing the presidents for exercising prudence. And I think it's cowardly for you as an elected representative of the Republican Party to attack him.
So thank you for your comment. I don't know that what I said amounts to attacking him, but you're free to characterize it as you'd like. I think that for me, when somebody asks me my opinion, I'm going to give it. That's what I think. Right, and you should, and I'm glad that you did. But I also think that the incident that happened, that the statement should have focused on the actual incident that happened, which is someone driving a car into a crowd and killing someone and injuring 19 other people. That's what happened. And the person that did that was a white supremacist. If you were to look at some of my writing on this, I actually didn't jump the gun. I actually waited I issued a brief statement Saturday, and then I had an interview yesterday, and I wrote an op-ed on this. Like, I'm out there with what my opinion is, and I do not, when we talk about creating equivalencies, there are people who are hateful. Doesn't necessarily mean they're just conservative, right? I mean, hate is hate. It's ugly. It should be denounced to the extent that the president has denounced it in other speeches. I would say that he is right to have denounced it. I think that in this political environment, to be perfectly honest with you, there are some who want you to take every single possible opportunity that you have to denounce the president to do it, and if you don't, then somehow you're just defending him when he shouldn't be defended. And then there are those who, if you at all denounce the president for anything, even if you agree with it, thinks that you're doing wrong because you're not standing behind the president. Well, what about the fact that I'm an elected member of Congress, one of 435, I represent 705,000 people, all of you sent me to Washington, even if you don't vote for me, I'm still there to represent you, that number one, I should get your input on how I'm going to vote, I should get your feedback, I should hear all sides of an issue, but that once I vote or when I'm asked on my opinion, I should give my honest opinion. And if you don't like it, that's fine. You can criticize me for it. But I also should not offer my honest opinion because I'm afraid that some political party or some person is not going to like what I had to say, right? Like, you want me to be honest with you so that you can honestly evaluate me as your member of Congress. And I don't expect you, sir, or anyone else in this room to agree with everything I say all of the time because we live in a democracy. It's the marketplace of ideas. We all have different opinions. I will just make sure that I give you my honest assessment on the issues of the day.
Okay, let's moving on here. Linda Schreider from Mount Gretna. And while you're filling out your questions, if you could, there's a couple on here that don't have any names, so I can't call people up if I don't have a name. So make sure you put your name.
Just ask the question if you want. If you just want to ask it, it's up to you.
Hi. I know you didn't vote for the repeal and the replace of the Affordable Care Act, so I was just wondering if you will work with the Democrats to fix the Affordable Care Act so we have something that's viable in the future.
Yeah, so I work with anybody that's willing to work with me. Some of the Affordable Care Act provisions that I think need to be fixed are issues that I don't think Democrats will support, but then there are some issues with the Affordable Care Act that I think Democrats would support. We're not going to do, so what we all experienced over the past 4 months of Obamacare or Affordable Care Act repeal, replace, that's not happening. The Senate failed. We're not going to go back and take another bite at the apple of doing the whole major overhaul. So you're going to have to deal with the here and now challenges and problems of the Affordable Care Act and either make it better or allow the individual health insurance marketplace to deteriorate further, because it is deteriorating. 1/3 of all counties in the country only have one insurance provider for the individual markets. Some counties actually don't have any providers. So I have pledged to do that. I'm in something called the Problem Solvers Caucus. We're trying to find common ground. Most people think that the cost-sharing reductions, which the president appropriately committed to funding, coupled with the medical device tax repeal, as well as looking at the Affordable Care Act provisions intended to allow states more flexibility in how they administer the insurance program, are the right steps forward for the balance of this session of Congress.
Wayne Heinzelman from Womelsdorf.
Thanks for being here. Was it Womelsdorf National Night Out a couple of weeks ago where they dedicated the new playground there in the...
No, yeah. Well, my question is really a follow-up to the ACA.
Yes.
Can Congress force the president to assure the insurance companies that they will receive their funds for those who depend on funding for their insurance?
One of the problems with the Affordable Care Act is that it vests, unconstitutionally I would argue, too much authority in the executive branch to administer health care policy. And so when the president alone gets to decide whether to provide the subsidy support so that middle and low-income Americans can purchase health insurance in the individual marketplace. When the president gets to decide that, that's too much power for a president. That should be subject to the congressional appropriations process. So what I want to do is move it over to the appropriations process for so long as our health insurance funding in the system is as it presently is. The president has said he will fund it, but I think it's a lot cleaner and there's more stability if it is subject to congressional oversight and appropriations. And so we have legislation that would do that. For two reasons. One, I think it provides more stability. Two, I think that that's the constitutional approach to this, whereas the way we're doing it now is not constitutional. If you think about it, we have tax dollars going to Washington, D.C., and the president alone shouldn't have the authority to decide whether or not to make the health insurance marketplace work for middle and low-income Americans or not. That should not be one, and it shouldn't be President Obama, and it shouldn't be President Trump, and it shouldn't be, what's your last name? You. Next question. Yes. There's a number of provisions in the ACA that are problematic because it vests way too much authority in the executive branch. To say nothing of, for instance, the medical device tax is a job killer. And with the medical device tax, you don't get taxed. And by the way, our region of the country is home to a lot of medical device manufacturers. There are a lot of employment opportunities there. And you don't get taxed on your profit. You get taxed on the moment that you ship that device out the door, even if you don't get paid, 2.3%. So where do you think there's going to be more R&D in the medical device space in the future with or without that tax? The obvious answer is without that tax. And when you talk about improving public health outcomes, the best way to go about improving public health outcomes is to do more R&D and to innovate more and to get better drugs in the marketplace and to get more in the way of medical devices in the marketplace so that we can improve public health outcomes.
Those were the questions that were written down for healthcare, but does anybody have any other questions on healthcare before we move on? Hold on a second. Let me get you the mic. Hold on a second.
Are you introducing a bill to make that a Congress decision, to take it away from the...
Yeah, we have Problem Solvers Caucus is going to be filing something in that respect. About 20-some Democrats and 20-some Republicans. Yes. Yeah, we start as that as the basis.
Okay.
I don't think I need that.
Name and where you live.
Tom Garris, I live in Robizonia.
Everybody can hear you.
Okay. Yes, yeah, I don't think I need that.
I think, how long would it take if the politicians' health care program was mixed in with our health care program to get there? Why don't you guys have the same health care program that we do?
You're aware that I do.
You do?
You're aware of that?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, I pay for my health insurance. I have a Blue Cross plan. I pay for it. Look it up, and if you want the specifics, we can give you the specifics. This notion that somehow I have some sweet deal is misplaced.
That seems to be
Yeah, it is. It's definitely the general belief, but there's a lot of general beliefs out there that aren't necessarily true. I would encourage you, call my office tomorrow. I'll give you all the details of it. I pay for it.
The perception view when the repeal or replace and try to be revisions.
So the question was on the repeal and replace effort, why Congress wasn't included in that? Yeah, that's a fair question. And who here knows what I mean when I use the term reconciliation? Okay, reconciliation requires 51 votes in the Senate. You can do it once a year after you pass a budget with instructions. And under the rules of reconciliation, and what the Senate parliamentarian said is that you couldn't, you had to do it because of the way that the Affordable Care Act was passed under Harry Reid, with bringing the congressional employees, the way that the legislation was passed, you had to separate it out. And then you had people that tried to cure that and they weren't allowed to because the Senate parliamentarian couldn't do it. But guess what? Didn't pass the Senate. We are where we are. Some of you want to know what my health care plan is. If you call my office tomorrow, they'll give you all the details. It's not free. I pay for it just like everyone else. Yes?
Can I ask if you were to leave Congress
If I were to leave Congress,
defeated,
right?
would you lose that health care?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's one of the problems in this country is it's tied to employment.
And it should be, and so portability, I think, for health insurance is extremely important, which is to say your health insurance follows you, just like your electronic health records should follow you. That's a whole other subject within healthcare that we could talk about. One piece of legislation that I think would be very helpful, and if you go to the Midwest, you see this, a lot of people get their health insurance through the Farm Bureau. Pooled, P-O-O-L-E-D, insurance, association plans. Sometimes your local chamber of commerce will have that. But the ability for an individual to pool with others to create a larger risk pool, I think is really very important to providing stability to the individual and small group health insurance marketplace. Because one of the challenges is you don't have enough people in those pools, and so therefore it's very difficult to spread risk, and so therefore because you have less people there, you have less insurance companies willing to offer plans, and so the less choice you have, the less competition there is, the more they can control what rates are, and the disproportionate bargaining power they have with the medical provider community. And I agree with what you just said there too, right, in terms of having portability across state lines. I agree. Let's go in the back. We got some questions. So we want to definitely lead with
Ben Thompson from Lebanon.
Well, I'm just going to paraphrase here. This is about North Korea, and I'm wondering, is our government doing it, or has it been suggested that we get together with China and possibly Russia and go in there and get that regime out of there and then get rid of those nuclear weapons, and then the U.S. pull out? Because from what I understand, China is worried that if we go in there and clean them out and then we unify the Koreas, we'll move our forces up to the Chinese border.
Yeah, so I think let's separate China from Russia, because this is really about China, because the only reason North Korea can even exist is because of China. 90% of their economic activity, 90% of their goods and services come from China, which is why I think President Trump, in dealing with China as he has, as well as how he has essentially projected to North Korea that he's not going to tolerate the threats, is now created a circumstance where I think China realizes that we're serious and that we are going to require them to lean on North Korea in terms of denuclearization. Look, we just passed a sanctions bill against North Korea and Russia and Iran, and it would be a lot better, right, if this were just a multilateral approach where we just did sanctions and then North Korea started behaving. But we've been trying that for almost 30 years, and that hasn't happened, which is why I think the president's approach in terms of triangulating and forcing China to the table and not taking no for an answer right away what has proven itself thus far to be a very smart negotiating strategy to sort of exact leverage there, because we need to be careful with how we deal with China economically. Slapping tariffs on everything isn't the answer. I think if you asked our agricultural sector, that could be problematic. But at the same point in time, doing nothing and allowing China to do whatever they want with us and cheat and steal our intellectual property and dump steel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, needs to come to an end. And I think the more forceful we are with China and the more clear we are with North Korea about what is not acceptable and will not be tolerated, without taking anything off the table, but without necessarily saying what we will do, is the right approach. So that's my belief on China and North Korea thus far. I think the president, what did he say? Fire and fury or whatever he said. I mean, I've never heard a president say that, but we're at a moment in time where if you look at where we were a couple of weeks ago and where we are now, what we're hearing and seeing from North Korea and China, there has been a reaction that is directionally more towards what we want to see. So it's not over, though. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not like just because North Korea said, oh, we're not going to go after Guam next week that somehow this problem's solved. It's not. And it's not going to go away. Yes, sir.
Follow-up questions?
Thank you very much. Phil Stober from Lebanon. So my question is a follow-up on that. So Steve Bannon, President Trump's main, I guess, advisor, is telling a totally different story. He says there's no chance, there's no winnable war in Korea, and I would probably agree with him, as I think most people in the room would. So how does that square with, we're sending mixed messages, don't you think?
I don't know a couple things. I don't know what Steve Bannon has or hasn't said. And I don't take stock in what one advisor to the president may say at a given point in time, because different advisors obviously have different opinions. There's been a lot of talk about this will not resolve itself until you have unification between North and South Korea. I don't want to get too much into the land of hypothetical. And I don't know what specifically Steve Bannon said. So it's difficult for me to respond.
Well, he was quoted in the paper yesterday as saying that there's no winnable war in Korea. 20,000 deaths just in conventional weaponry.
Well, in Seoul is right now, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's an artillery shell fire away. So he's sending one message to the world, because I'm not...
Who is Steve Bannon?
Steve Bannon.
Well, he's not the president.
No, but well, my point is the administration
Yeah.
is sending out mixed messages.
Yeah.
So how can we have a consistent foreign policy in Korea specifically when the highest people in the administration can't seem to agree?
But that's not unusual. If you go back to President Obama, his advisors were sending mixed messages on Afghanistan and Syria for years.
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about right now, right?
Yes, respectfully.
That's over. The conflict right now, the hottest one is Korea right now. So yes, we've been in Afghanistan for 15 years. That's been a combination. That's both parties have gotten us into that. But right now, this situation that has most people awake at night is some guy in Korea who's got nuclear weapons, and so do we. And so with inconsistent messaging, it seems to me we can stumble into conflict. Neither party might want it, but that's how all wars have started in the past, is miscalculation.
But respectfully, my point in pointing out that in the Obama administration there were mixed messages on Afghanistan and Syria at certain points in time is evidence that it is not uncommon for an administration to have various advisors leaking or coming right out and saying what their opinion is. It is still ultimately the President of the United States. And Afghanistan still is very problematic, as is Syria. And I always want to be careful when we use the WAR word, that I don't venture too far down a path right there, because Congress has a role, the President has a role, and I need to be very responsible and contained in how I speak about hypotheticals like that. But if the point I believe that you were trying to make is you may want to see a particular type of policy relative to North Korea, but even more so, you're concerned about the lack of coherence or unanimity around what that policy is. I don't have any control over that. I would say it's obviously always better to have any administration have all their advisors say precisely the same thing, so that the American people and other nations, our allies and our adversaries, know that we are locked in and unified on one specific approach. But there's nothing I can do. Steve Bannon's going to say what he's going to say. It doesn't matter what I have to say about it. Let's go. Go ahead.
One more on this issue, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Hi, my name is Homer Williams. I'm from Reading, Pennsylvania.
What's your first name?
Homer Williams.
Yep, very good.
Thank you first for coming today. I appreciate it. Second, you brought up a really interesting point about Congress's constitutional duty to declare wars. For the last 15 or 20 years, Congress has abdicated its responsibilities and refused to say yes or no about the wars in Afghanistan and everywhere else in the world. What are you doing to move forward with Congress either saying yes or no to these wars And whom are you working with to do that?
It's an excellent question. The term I'm going to use, I'm going to probably say it a couple times in the next minute or two, is AUMF, Authorized Use for Military Force, AUMF. So in 2001, Congress passed an AUMF that authorized our military to go after Al-Qaeda, to go into Iraq. That then also meant Afghanistan, and through a period of 17 years now, we've essentially conducted our overseas military operations under an AUMF, which many argue we are now exceeding the scope of what that AUMF authorized. I agree with that, in the sense that I think we need a new AUMF that is much more clear and that channels our military operations based on a set of metrics or facts, so that we don't just sort of have an open-ended directive to the president to utilize military operations wherever he wants, whenever he wants, under an AUMF that I think at this point has outlived its, not usefulness, but outlived the specificity that I think is required, given the fact that we're obviously in a different world with some new threats over a 17-year period. So you're going to ask yourself the question, well, why hasn't this happened before? I felt we should have done this when President Obama was in office. There was some discussion in doing that. What we ran into is some Democrats wanted to really narrow the scope of it. Some Republicans wanted to make it even more open-ended, so that a president had more flexibility or the more instantaneous ability to go conduct a military operation that they felt was necessary. And there are actually some valid points on both sides of this debate. If you argue for a more circumscribed or narrow AUMF, you're going to make sure that the president is accountable to Congress, and you, the American people, have more say to your representatives on a given vote before a particular military operation could occur. There is something very compelling to be said about that. At the same point in time, given the instability in the Middle East, and given that terrorism is not necessarily conducted just by nation states anymore, but by terrorist organizations that can, and then you see where Iran sort of funnels and funds terrorism, to name just one nation. Shouldn't a president be able to have an AUMF that is able to utilize strikes and conduct military operations based upon intelligence that they have at that time that we may not know, or that you may not know and I may get an intelligence briefing on? I get back to directly answer your question. I think we should have a new AUMF, but unless and until we have a Congress that agrees on language for a new AUMF, the only other option, other than proceeding with an outdated AUMF, is to have no AUMF, and the president loses the ability to conduct military operations, which I think is the worst of all of the different examples. Your feedback.
And Congress could very quickly rectify that, because if you begin a fire, instead of being able to go, well, Congress would have to get together and either approve it or not approve it, which is what the Constitution says you are supposed to do. Right. So.
Next up, Pamela Heineman from Lebanon, Jobs and Education.
Okay. When are the costs of education and the dearth of good-paying jobs going to be addressed? Lowering taxes on the job makers has only gotten us more expensive education with no job certainty for the effort, and available jobs cannot support families. They keep eliminating jobs by outsourcing to third world countries or automate everything. I have my adult son and my adult daughter live with me. My daughter's husband and her son live with me, and a friend of mine and her child lives with me. I'm the only one with a decent income that's supporting all these people. I can't keep doing this, but there's no jobs, and it's like I can't convince my son to go back to school because all he sees is a crap ton of debt that he'd have to deal with. So I don't know what to do to help them at all.
There's a lot of, so you mentioned the term tax cut. Let me just focus on education, workforce development, and creating more economic opportunity for those that don't have a college education, and then also briefly address the cost of higher education. Because I think if I address the cost of higher education and workforce development and the skills that we need and what employers are looking for, hopefully that will address sort of what you've raised. And if I don't do it well enough, by all means, you can follow up. The cost of higher education, number one, students that go to school should know what the value of their degree is in the marketplace. They should know what majors lead to jobs. They should know what skills are needed from employers. And the other thing that we don't have that we need is more transparency in what that tuition is going to pay. People say, well, maybe we should just do more in the way of Pell Grants or more student aid. But if you look since 1980, as the increase in student aid has come about for kids going to college, the cost of college tuition has far outpaced that. So that in and of itself is certainly no answer. And I think colleges need to do a better job. And by need, I mean that means they should be required to provide more transparency in what that tuition goes for. The more, I think, interesting and productive policy making is happening in career and technical education. We had a roundtable earlier today. We're about to reauthorize the Perkins Act. This is for those who don't go to college but go to a trade school. And a couple things. One, I think that we need to do a better, I'm going to really get into the weeds a little bit. We are testing our students too much. There are too many curriculum mandates in secondary education. If you don't have Washington, D.C. telling you what you need in your curriculum, and you don't have Washington, D.C. putting out more testing requirements, which we've passed legislation to do that, now it just needs to be implemented, so that a school district has less days preparing for tests, less days teaching to the test and testing. That is more days to teach skills and the type of instruction that will help create career awareness so that you don't necessarily have to go to college, but you can learn that, hey, by the time you're in high school, you can actually go to your local vo-tech school and start down toward the path of certification for HVAC repair. There's a number of technology-related jobs in the manufacturing sector that don't require a college degree that will pay you $50,000, $60,000 when you're 19, 20 years old. And if we have kids at the age of 12 and 13 being made aware of that, knowing that they can start their career path while in high school, you are training kids for jobs that are needed with employer input without them having to pay a college tuition to do it, on the path towards certification in some of those professions. And you have your local employers saying, this is what needs to happen for me to hire people. Related to that, we're going to have 5 million new advanced manufacturing jobs created in the next 5 years, and we already know that 3 million of them are going to go unfilled because we don't have folks that have this job-ready skills to do that. So I think there's tremendous opportunity, and what we're doing at the federal level is saying we're not going to tell you how to design your workforce development programs, and the funds that we give you, we're going to let you judge success based on what you want to do right here in Lebanon County. We're not going to give you performance metrics that, yeah, you might get more people into the workforce tomorrow, but it might be for jobs that won't be here in 5 years. We should not only be training dislocated workers, we should be training workers that are already employed that may not have a job in 5 or 10 years because of automation or because of advanced technology, so that, number one, people are keeping jobs, but number two, to your son and daughter, did you say? They are looking at a job market that doesn't require a college degree. They may be looking at an instance where apprenticeships are being offered through it could be through a community college, it could be through a local chamber-related workforce development initiative. So if you take curriculum and testing, push it back a little bit, create more flexibility for a public education system to deal with what skills you need to enter into the job market at an earlier age, then by the time they're 18, 19, and 20, they already have a head start there. And then when you have the Perkins Act, which is funding that's federal, that gets down and is intended to be used to help your son and daughter and others get the skills needed to go get the job, because that's what employers want and that's what they need, and they're not getting it to the capacity right now that they do need, because there are a lot of unfilled jobs in this country. There are. That, to me, is the right framework and approach to it.
Well, what about jobs that don't need all this training and that? We still need people that will stock shelves at the pizza. You don't need to go to school for that, but if those are the jobs that are there, they should at least be somewhat able to support their family, or at least support themselves, instead of having to depend on me for half of their life because they're getting enough paycheck.
Do you want to talk about minimum wage for a second? Because it seems like you're sort of...
It all covers all of it, because it's like if they don't get paid enough, you can't afford anything. You can't afford your education, you can't afford health care, you can't afford a house, you can't afford anything.
I agree with what you said, and when I mentioned up front that there's a lot to your question, there is a lot to your question. It's sort of like the life cycle of how one becomes employed, and how do you ensure that there are jobs that are family sustaining, and what is the role of education, what is the role of employers, what is the role of tax and regulatory reform within that, because the more money that a company has, the more they can reinvest it, the more they can lift wages. Incidentally, I think the best way to go about increasing wages is for the labor market to be so tight that employers literally have to raise wages because they're competing against other employers for those jobs. That is always how our capitalist system has worked. Having said all that, our minimum wage is very low. So if you want to increase the minimum wage $1 or so, I'm fine with that. You just need to make sure that if you increase it so much, you will force some companies into more automation. I mean, you will lose jobs if you increase that minimum wage too much. It happens some. But there's also, look, the other thing I feel, there are some jobs that are going to be created by technology. There are a lot of jobs that are going to be created by technology. Not everyone's capable of them. You're totally right. What are we doing to design our educational system and our workforce development system so that we do have people for those jobs? And what I'm saying is, you don't necessarily need a college degree for all those jobs. We need to make sure that those who aren't pursuing a college education are aware of that, and that our workforce development programs are training in those skills areas so that employers are there at the door for a handoff. Not a handout, a handoff into the employment sector. I haven't heard from...
Cornell from the city councilman back here, I think. Want to ask about CTEs?
Okay. I just want to know if there's a good jobs and infrastructure bill that you know that's being worked on and has bipartisan support. We can't keep going where one party or another party, I'm not blaming any party, plays political games rather than sitting and working to whatever happened when you sat and worked together and came up with some good things like you did in years in the past. And is there a good infrastructure bill or a job bill, or both, that will get bipartisan support and go to the president and he would sign it, and we could have... our infrastructure is horrible in America. And that leads into jobs, obviously. Is there a bill out there or something that can get bipartisan support and go to the president?
I think that's a great question, and that's my focus. So number one, there are probably more bipartisan victories than people may realize. You just don't hear about them because cable news and social media and the internet, usually focuses on the divisions. We're about to pass, reauthorize a children's health insurance, a CHIP bill in September. We are going to reauthorize the Perkins Act, which most people agree with. Most people agree with you and I that, number one, we have more roads deteriorating, more miles of roads than any other state in the country. We have more structurally deficient bridges than any other state in the country. We rely more on passenger rail than other parts of the country. When you look at our electricity grid, it is woefully outdated. dangerously, I don't want to, let me take the word dangerously back. Yeah, you can't, you're right, I'm at a town hall, you can't. There are cybersecurity threats relative to our energy grid. That's infrastructure too. Same with rural broadband. And so from an infrastructure perspective, to your point, Cornell, you could do a big infrastructure bill. And if you look at infrastructure, it's kind of like spokes on a wheel. It's roads, it's bridges, it's passenger rail, it's rural broadband, it's electricity grid, and there's some others. And I've always felt you can't just improve one of those spokes. It has to be everything. And when you do that, not only are you modernizing everything, but you're getting buy-in from everyone. You're going to have urban Democrats say, you're going to put money into passenger rail? We have $20 billion in passenger rail upgrades in the Northeast Corridor alone, which we rely on, and which is 20% of the country's GDP. Most of us don't use airports every day, but when we use them, I hope everything's safe there, right? And from an energy grid perspective, obviously, that's something that I think we all sort of take it for granted, but until the lights don't come on. That is ripe for bipartisanship. It'd be helpful if the president provides more details in terms of what the funding streams are and sort of the allocation of funds, like what's going towards what pieces of that puzzle. If you do that, you are creating a safer, healthier country with a more modern infrastructure system, and you will create a lot of jobs. Most of them are short-term, but putting people back to work for a couple years while we're rebuilding our country is a very good thing. And the other thing is this. Who here thinks that people in Washington, D.C. are getting along and getting a lot of stuff done right now? No hands are going up. So why don't we do things where people, there's some consensus to try and restore some credibility and confidence to our political system. So I think that's workforce development and infrastructure improvements are two areas where I think the country wants to see consensus, leadership from the president, and a president that is going to be able to probably get some legislative successes on both sides of the aisle for that. That's a good question. Let me just make sure, because I'll make sure you get another question before the end. I just want to make sure we keep it moving.
John Beavers from Cornwall, Lebanon.
First, thank you for all the work you do for veterans.
Thank you for what you and all the veterans have done to make our country what it is.
Your weekly email blast is always full of very interesting work that you're doing in the House. And regarding the survey questions that you always have there, I'm wondering how can they be more prepared so that you can get a specific answer? Because a lot of the options, the choices to click on there are pretty broad, and I often find that they don't fit into an answer that I would like to give you.
Okay. Question was basically, so if you haven't signed up for my e-newsletter, I would encourage you to do it. It goes out once a week. It tells you literally every single vote I ever took and why I voted the way that I did, as well as where I went in the past week, what I might be working on in committee. And then we always have a poll question. And sometimes I've been accused of saying, you rigged the answer with your answers. And it's like, actually, we actually want to try and get a broad cross-section of potential answers so we at least kind of know what's most important to you on that list, or whether you support something or not support it, and what your reason is. So sometimes I promise you we do the best that we can, but that doesn't mean we always get it as good as you wish that we would get it. The other thing about that is sometimes how one person may answer could give us an indication on other things I might be working on that would be of interest to that person based on how they answered. But you're not the first person to say that. My staff does an excellent job with it, but it's always hard to come up with a totally comprehensive yet neat and tidy 4 potential answers to any one complicated question. Some weeks it works better than others, and we ask some pretty sometimes we'll ask some pretty juicy questions in there, right? Like, marijuana legalization, transgender, military stuff, all sorts of, we're not just asking politically safe stuff. We want to know, you're my voice in Washington. And you know more about what is going on any given day in your local community than I do. And so I rely on you to share with me what you're thinking. And you'll be surprised how often the answers that we get back are, I didn't know it was going to be that hot. Now, we have a little working hypothesis on, we might have a little disproportionately larger ideological share of people that participate in that, and that's fine. But we get some interesting feedback on a number of issues that is telling, and it would probably surprise you a little bit on some issues. But we'll keep trying to do better with that. If you have specific suggestions on how we can do better, I'll take, we're trying to be just remember, the point of me asking a question is to get as much feedback, as much deep feedback as possible. So the more pinpointed the answers are, the better intel, the better data I get. So so when someone says, and we do get this occasionally on Facebook, you got to be careful what people say on Facebook, particularly on my page. But people say, well, you asked the question in such a way that you get the answer you want. I don't want a particular answer. I want good, raw, honest data so that I know what my constituents are thinking. Who's next?
Patricia Thompson from Reading.
Hi, how are you?
I work for the VA here in Lebanon, but my question is regarding the VBA, Veterans Benefit Administration.
Yes.
What's being done to reduce the backlog of the service-connected disability claims? And then I asked about Camp Lejeune. Any update on the disability claims for Camp Lejeune?
I don't have any update for you at this moment, but I can certainly get you an update very shortly. The backlog. President Trump has instituted a number of very good reforms on the regulatory side in terms of improving the VA. He's also signed into law some legislation that I think is going to bring about more accountability to the VA. I do want to say this. You said you work at the Lebanon VA. The Lebanon VA does an exceptional job. If you were to ask, and there are survey after survey, veterans and the marks that the Lebanon VA gets for its medical care is one of the top VA hospitals in the country.
Want to stay with the VA.
Correct, and I agree with that. So I say that to you, and I wanted to say that to everyone, because as we talk about problems in the VA and improvements that need to be made, I want to make sure that when I say that, that is in no way intended to be, backlog of VA. We're going to get a new computer system which will help. But in the short term, you should have there's like three buckets, right? There's legislation to this effect, which I support. A claim that has been remanded and requires new hospital records, or you're going to have to go get a new health checkup. A claim which the record's out there, it just wasn't there when the claim was evaluated, which you can get that record up quickly, but the problem is once it's remanded, then you have to wait 6 or 9 months, and it shouldn't. All you got to do is go get the record and send it over there, and it should be electronic, so it should be there next week. And then third, a claim that you disagree with the finding and you're trying to appeal it up. The claim that is most problematic is the claim where a veteran goes in, gets denied because they didn't have all the records with them, and so it was remanded, and now all of a sudden you're in a backlog scenario where, because the remand really slows it up, right? So if you take that bucket and don't remand it right away, but sort of freeze frame it and allow those records to come henceforth, you will do a lot in the way of reducing the claims backlog. That's a big piece of it. Boy, the case management side of the VA, legislation, okay, everybody knows this. Just because you pass a bill and it becomes law doesn't fix anything until the agency goes about making those changes. And some of this stuff on the VA side can be done entirely within the VA, and I think that they're in the process of doing that. I think we increased VA funding last year, largely because of the Hep C drugs, but I would like to see more in the way of cleaning the deck, because once you have a system in place that reduces the number of claims backlogs, moving forward, you've done a really good thing. But until you clean up the claims backlog, you're just the situation just becomes exacerbated by that. So I think you need to sort of take those claims, those that are already have a backlog, clean it up the way I suggested, and which is being done, and then moving forward, make sure that we don't end up in the same circumstance by creating a new claims review process. There's also an expedited hearing process that can occur. That would be another way to facilitate quicker claims reviews. Go ahead. Follow up?
11 years. 11 years I've been fighting the VA.
Have we been working with you?
Yeah. I haven't gotten a call back from Lisa since I called her and left a voicemail on her message system stating that I caught a doctor at the Philadelphia VA Medical Center falsifying my medical record. To which the director of the hospital, the chief of staff, and the patient advocate have all attempted to cover up with no investigation done. However, that doctor's supervisor did manage to call me and ask me not to report it to the state medical board.
This could be very complicated, but it's also going to be real simple. You're a high priority. You will hear from us. We're your advocate. That's what we're supposed to do.
I just want to know what you think is the best way, since the patient advocate's office is the last stop at the VA.
Best way is to use my case first.
What irritates me about the VA is the fact that if I go to a regular hospital and use my United Healthcare, at the bottom of every form that the hospital gives me, it says if I'm unhappy with at any point in time, I have the right to talk to the director of the hospital. You don't have that at the VA. In fact, he's got the nicest office in the building, but you can't talk to him. You can't even request a meeting with him at his convenience. They don't get it.
We're here to help, and we will get back to you.
I went there today. Spent 3 hours.
All right, Ann Dahl from Lebanon.
Okay, I'd like to thank you again for coming out to this corner of your really strangely shaped district.
If I get on this side.
My question is for a friend, and it reacts very nicely with the backdrop here. Would you allow the Farm Service Agency to cut low-interest loans to small farmers? Those loans are used for equipment and building improvements.
Would I allow
The Farm Service Agency to cut back on low-interest loans to small farmers?
No, I think that the loan pool, the loan capacity should remain. I think, look, we're at an interesting time from an agricultural policy perspective. The rise of organic farming, best practices in terms of getting the most out of your land. You don't need as much, and we also have a lot of people that like farm to table, that do the local CSA, where I think in the new economy, so to speak, a small farmer has more opportunity today than they have in quite some time to get a competitive advantage in the local marketplace. Agribusiness is agribusiness, but I want to make sure that a small farmer, not small in height, but small in their acreage, has the ability to farm and make a profit and have access to the most modernized best practices techniques, and has the ability to pass that farm on to their children or grandchildren without having to deal with such a big tax bill or such complicated estate planning that the son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter chooses that it's just too expensive or just too costly to do. And if you don't have that conduit that the agency provides, then you're going to lose more and more small farms. So I hope I answered your question there.
Try not to allow the Farm Service to cut those loans?
Yes, I will try to. Boy, that's a tricky one. I will do what you want me to do there.
Okay.
Whether it was a yes or a no based upon how you framed the question. Yeah.
One more thing. If you ever want to talk about electronic health records, give me a call.
Very good. Yeah, the EHR companies don't want to give the data to the patients. They want to keep it for their own self. What do you got?
Linda Barnhart, Womelsdorf.
I didn't know this was going to involve public speaking.
I didn't either. I didn't know I was going to have to.
Okay. After witnessing the GOP's aggressive attempt to take away health care from millions of folks, and thank you, by the way, for voting against that, I'm afraid for Social Security and Medicare. I'm afraid they'll be next.
Not
obviously,
touching it. We're not touching it.
Okay. You don't want me to read the rest?
The president
then?
said we're not touching it.
Well, I know he said it, but I don't buy it. I know there are some issues, but there are some ways to fix it that don't involve a lot of immediate pain, like raising the wage cap, the amount that we collect on, which I believe, correct me, is it 118?
I think it is 118.
118. I mean, raising that up to 200, 250 would fix it, from what I understand, for 50, 60 years. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on this, but you just told me you're not touching it.
We're not. One area where you will see some, it's called Medicare reforms. This is bipartisan too. CMS can oftentimes make determinations on what's Medicare reimbursable. Sometimes they can't because of the statutory framework that they're working with. So sometimes Congress has to update what is and is not reimbursable under Medicare, and particularly with the advent of telehealth or telemedicine and the way that you can get information to your doctor or hospital, we can, believe it or not, we can provide a higher quality, lower cost healthcare services in some ways under the Medicare program by authorizing CMS to reimburse medical providers for certain services that right now are not Medicare reimbursable. And in doing so, cut down on the number of doctor visits. It also tends to be much more in the way of preventative health care. So there are some potential cost savings just by modernizing some Medicare reimbursement services. So that's something that will actually happen this fall. The other thing is under Medicare, whether it's 10% or 20%, you hear this, how much is waste, fraud, and abuse. The auditing on the Medicare side, that needs to continue, but you also need to look at Inspector General reports, and they point out where it's called program integrity, right? Like how And you can improve the program integrity of Medicare simply by following the recommendation of the Inspector Generals. This doesn't mean less care for anyone. It just means that whether it's a medical equipment or physician or whomever isn't taking advantage of the way that the program works. So there's another area of savings.
Walt Allen, Cornwall.
Well, first I want to thank our Congressman Costello for having the meeting tonight. It's really nice to be able to have one locally. My question is, with our debt that we have accumulated in the last 8 years, doubling from $9 trillion to
20.
Now approaching $20 trillion.
Right.
And if it continues on that trend, it'll be $40 trillion at the end of the next 8 years. What is our Congress doing to bring our debt under control, first of all? And what are they doing to start reviewing line by line in the budget to know what is in the budget, so we just don't vote on an omnibus that is all-inclusive and includes everything but the kitchen sink?
Well, guess what? We're voting on an omnibus in September. There's no way around it, unless you want to shut down the government, which I don't support. Couple things. Before we can even address tackling the debt, which is subtracting from that $20 trillion, you have to look at your deficit spending, which is approximately $500 billion a year. Could be a little more, could be a little less. Still a huge number. 66% of our federal budget is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. You put interest payments on the debt on top of that and military spending, there's not a lot left over. VA, infrastructure, a whole host of other things. So when you talk about trying to cut your way, I'm not saying you said this, but any discussion about cutting spending such that we can balance a budget and start paying down the debt, you're just not going to get there. The way that you first have to address this is, how do you get to a balanced budget? The way you get to a balanced budget is to get more in the way of federal receipts. I think, and economic data will support this, we're growing on average of about 1.8% a year, GDP. In the 80s, we were growing at 3.5%. In the 90s, we were doing pretty well. You need to look at how we can have economic growth at 2.5%, 3%. Over a 10-year period, my staff hears me say this a lot, but over 10 years, 1/10 of an increase in average GDP growth. So if you're growing at 2.1% instead of 2% over 10 years, that 1/10 of a percentage point is good for $500 billion. So if you grow at 3% rather than 2% over a 10-year period, you're talking about $5 trillion. You're talking about getting close to a balanced budget. The first thing we have to do is get to a balanced budget. How do you get to a balanced budget? I think it is a combination of regulatory reforms and tax reform. Tax reform comes in lower rates for those people who create jobs and for low and middle income Americans, coupled with confidence that the government is going to issue more regulations which are going to cost business more dollars. If you look back, the combination of Jimmy Carter's deregulatory agenda and Ronald Reagan's tax cuts, most economists will say, led to a substantial increase in economic growth. And you have President Trump open to doing substantial tax reform, and he has enacted a deregulatory agenda, much of which I voted for, to the consternation of some on the left, just so you know. I get it from the right. I get it from the left. Sometimes, I do what I think is right. But my point is, you have to deal with the economic growth policies that are going to get us to a balanced budget. Because in my opinion, if we increase taxes, there was some who say, well, if you want more federal revenue, just increase taxes. I think you will not get economic growth. You'll get less of it. And you won't ever reach what you think you will reach in terms of federal receipts. So you grow, you gain by growing, you balance the budget by growing. And look, there are spending reforms that should be made. But I actually think from a healthcare perspective, we have opportunities through technology and through innovation to really enable people to live healthier, longer lives less expensively. And I believe there are a number of job growth areas in this country, particularly if we simplify our tax code and we lower rates. Then you can start talking about how to pay down $20 trillion in debt. Obviously, the other big question here is the trade deals, right? NAFTA needs modernized. The economy from 1994 isn't the economy of 2017. I think we have, if you look at what our energy policy was over the past 20 years and how much money we just sent overseas and the energy policies that we may have 10 and 20 years from now, do you know how much GE is investing in wind and solar right now? Do you know how many good jobs that can be created in this country? People, and it's not just on the technology, it's on the people installing that stuff. I mean, there are tremendous clean energy opportunities in this country. So I'm optimistic that we can grow and get to a balanced budget, and then we'll have to start trimming that down. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't just happen through It doesn't happen through cutting. You need to grow to get there.
Len Schott, Myerstown.
Congressman, I'd like to, for the last 8 years, all we heard was, give us a House, give us a Senate,
Yes.
give us a White House.
Yes.
And we're going to show you how government should be done. Well, when are you going to start?
Is that anything else to add to that?
Well, I had health care, but that's been answered.
Very good. Thank you, Len. Sometimes when people ask me that question, it's accompanied by a lot of four-letter words, too. Point is, I said sometimes when people ask me that line of questioning, it's accompanied by some four-letter words. The point is there's frustration and there's anger by a lot of Republicans that look and say, what has been done, right? Just to your point. Healthcare and tax reform, let me put right here, and let me put everything else over here. Since Harry Truman, the House, in the first 2 years of every president, including Truman, up until now, that first Congress that the president dealt with, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, I don't know if Ford's included in that, but Carter, Reagan, H.W., Clinton, W., Obama, and now Trump. This House of Representatives has passed more legislation out of the House than any House of Representatives since Harry Truman was elected. Why don't we, right? Let me just, that's number one. Number two, the Congressional Review Act, which is a statute that allows a new Congress to go back in the final 100 legislative days of the previous president's administration and take any rule or regulation that was passed and override it, with the thought being sometimes presidents on their way out the door do stuff that they wouldn't do if they had to be held accountable for it. We have had 14 CRA votes to roll back rules that were enacted in the waning days of the Obama administration, and it is estimated that that has been a cost savings to our economy of $16 billion annually. We did a VA reform bill, but you have the Senate, which a combination of the administration not putting up a lot of people for confirmations for a lot of department secretaries and departments, with the Supreme Court nomination chewing up a couple weeks, with Chuck Schumer being pretty effective at just log jamming and slowing down everything in the Senate, and not a lot of clarity early on from the president in terms of what he wanted to see in a health care bill or a tax reform bill, because you really need your president to say what they want on these big picture things, right? Some of the smaller stuff, you know, the House and Senate can work on it, the administration can weigh in. But as a result of that, you don't hear about the number of bills that have passed the House. You don't even hear much about the CRAs, except from Democrats who don't like a lot of those CRA votes. I can tell you there's some people out there that have, you know, I get attack ads written against me for votes that I've taken that I think are pro-growth. But no matter what you feel about those bills or how much passed or how good some of that stuff may be, it's still health care and it's still tax reform. Those are the two big things that I think, you don't even have to be a Republican, right? Our tax code's screwed up. It's anti-growth. It encourages companies to relocate overseas if you have multinational operations. It doesn't allow you to bring your profits back unless you get taxed twice on it, which means companies are growing overseas rather than growing here. And our health care, the Affordable Care Act provides certain patient protections that I think are important. I do. I've said that all along. I've always campaigned on fixing our health care system. Whether that means you repeal it and replace it, but also include some of the protections that were in the Affordable Care Act, or whether you fix what I think is some government overreach and too much authority vested in the executive branch. The problem is we need fixes to our health care system. So your point about why aren't things getting done, I think some things have gotten done, more things do have to get done, but with health care reform failing and us not yet even getting to tax reform, if you're going to give a report card at this point in time, a lot of Republicans aren't going to give a good grade. I accept that. I would also suggest, though, that when you're talking about really complex, transformational type of, like that's really big. Most historians would say that if you got one of those pieces of legislation passed in a 2-year period, that would stand up to most other sessions of Congress as being more significant than what some sessions of Congress accomplish at all. Now, I'll let you follow up. We're 9 months in, almost 9 months in to a 2-year term. I think that passing really big, substantial legislation in this political environment, coupled with the way that outside money now gets to influence legislation in a way that never happened before. You see tens of millions of dollars getting thrown. You didn't see that in the 70s or 80s or 90s. You saw a little bit of the two people, Harry and somebody sitting at the table taking down Hillary Care, but nothing like it is now. So there are a lot of competing interests in our democracy. So I accept your question. I accept the premise as your question as being very valid, and you were raising your hand because you're going to follow up, and let me let you follow up.
What I don't understand, the GOP, which I'm a part of and have been for 61 years, that makes me 83. They had 7 years to work on this, or 7+ years.
Yeah.
And we still don't have it done. If business operated like that, they'd all fail.
Two things. One, you look really good for 83. And two, let's be honest. I've only been in Congress for 2 years and 9 months. But it's a lot easier saying that we need to do something with the Affordable Care Act than it is to come up with a replacement for it and get 218 votes in the House and get 51 votes in the Senate. And past sessions of Congress, there was never a replacement plan put on the House floor to vote on. And so you saw a bill that went on the House, went through committee, then before it got to the House floor, got reshaped. And you saw some Republicans ultimately vote no, such as I did, and you saw other Republicans that were going to vote no unless certain changes were made. And then it didn't pass the Senate. So even leaving aside some frustration that people may have with me or the House or whomever, it didn't pass the Senate. And it didn't pass the Senate with 51 votes. Wait till we get to health care. This is health insurance, by the way. This is health insurance reform. Wait till we get to health care, and you need to get 60 votes. That's the Senate. I'm not in the Senate. You cannot get certain stuff done in Congress and on the president's desk without Democrats to vote for it, because you don't have 60 votes in the Senate. And I also just think from the perspective of having legitimate, look, there are some people that still to this day take major issue with the Affordable Care Act on the Republican side because the Democrats didn't work with Republicans on it. And then they went out and they cut a deal with Nebraska and a couple other states for some sweetheart deals. And so there's always been a political argument against the Affordable Care Act because the Democrats didn't include the Republicans, right? That's legitimate. And the flip side, from the Democratic side of the aisle right now, is Republicans tried to do it all by themselves. And had it been done, there will be people that view that as illegitimate, right? So what I think is, in order to create a stable, enduring reform package to our healthcare system, you have to have buy-in from the American people. And I don't think you can get buy-in from the American people unless you have some semblance of bipartisanship. Having said that, Republicans are in control of the House, right? So you could see some Democrats agree with some things that get done, but still vote no because their votes aren't needed, right? I mean, that happens. It does happen. 7 years to do a replacement plan, but you never had to put it on the floor, so you never had to test the specificity of what a reform package would actually look like. I think pre-existing conditions coverage should be protected without contingency, right? Some other people wanted to create a waiver program to allow a state to dilute that principle. I disagree with it. So even within Republican circles, there's some disagreement about what that package should look like.
And we're almost 30 minutes over the time, but
times where there's the party of 6 or the party of 8, but then the parties destroy them and they can't work together. When they try to work together and come up with something together, Democrats and Republicans, when Obama was here, and hopefully they'll start it when Trump's here, but it seems like when they do try to go in a room of 8 and 6, that we destroy them, and then they back out and say, we're not going to do this or we can't do this. When can we allow people, who cares what party wins? It really, to me, is a win for the American people. If 8 people can go in a room and figure this out on both sides, but why do we destroy them when they go and try to work together?
Well, look, I think, I mean, I have town hall here tonight, right? Anybody can come, as long as you're a constituent and you pre-register, and then you get in as long as you never threaten me. It's pretty easy to get into a town hall of mine. But instead of some people coming, they want to stand on the other side of the street and protest. That's fine. But there's always going to be some people that make politics out of everything. And I think people like me just have to just take it, right? And search for answers and try and do good. And there are a lot of people that do this that are doing that. But it's complicated, big stuff, particularly when you're talking about healthcare reform, when you're talking about tax reform. We haven't even talked about immigration reform, because there are some people that want to include a little bit more, right? That want to make it bigger or broader or more comprehensive. Then there are some people, let me tell you just how dispositionally I am. Find out what people agree on, what's the majority say, make it even a little bit bigger than that so you get more buy-in, and pass the darn thing. And where we disagree, let's disagree tomorrow, and let's then debate that stuff, and we can fight about that stuff, but get done the stuff that people agree on. Incrementally move things forward. And if you can do something transformational because you have a big enough majority and you have consensus or buy-in from the American people, do something bigger. My further opinion on all that is, what's Congress's approval rating right now? 8%? What's the next question? How do 8% approve of what they're doing, right? I'm trying to be funny, but I guess that wasn't funny. The only way to restore credibility to the institutions that keep our republic what it is to build confidence in the American people that we are working for you. And right now, a lot of people don't think that we are. And so the way to do that is to get things done. And if you can't get some things done, focus on the things that you can get done. And over time, incrementally, you may be able to start restoring some credibility. And that's where I think that we have to head as a country. And if we can do it on tax reform, great. I know that we can do it on infrastructure. And I know that we can do it on workforce development. We could do it on some immigration areas, on visa reform. I mean, the agricultural sector, the high-tech sector. You make some good points.
Yeah, I think it's been mentioned a couple times, kind of on the side, but the money in politics. So you mentioned it, someone else mentioned it. I think that's a big problem with, like, especially healthcare. I think some of the reasons why that's not getting done is because there is lobbyists, money in pharmaceuticals, insurance companies, for-profit healthcare organizations. So what about, or what are your plans on lessening the influence of money within politics?
My feeling on that, look, the Supreme Court says, that's First Amendment, and it is, but there is a lack of transparency. You should know who's contributing to who, and particularly as you get close to election time, that should happen in real time. You shouldn't find out 30 days later. But increasingly, the money issue is on the advocacy side, outside, right? It's not your typical, most people when they talk about money in politics, it's the contributions to political people running for campaigns. Now, it's the super PAC and issue advocacy stuff on the outside. If you have contribution limits coupled with online, look up who gave them money, okay, there's accountability there. You know what's what, right? But when the Citizens for a Happy America spends $10 million chopping my head off, telling me to vote a certain way when I didn't, you don't know who they are, and you don't know who's funding them, you don't know what their agenda is, and you don't find out until well after the fact, there's no accountability there in our body politic. To me, that's the real issue.
Right. So what would we do?
Well, I think that you need to have immediate, when an ad goes up, or when money is getting spent, that you should know, number one, you have to have the disclaimer. You should know exactly who's putting into that. Because then what happens is you're going to have news media reports, you're going to have the opposition saying, oh, that's who's funding that. That's where that money's coming from. They're doing that because they're going to profit this way, or those are the people with the agenda. You know what I mean? And you don't have that fullness right now that you should.
Do you agree with that standing Citizens United?
There's a lot to Citizens United. Citizens United means a lot of things to a lot of. It was a Supreme Court case that has multiple parts of its holding. But if you're talking about more transparency, then I do. And contribute.
Wasn't there a bill or a proposal for more open or more transparency brought by a representative from Florida that had 10 Republican co-signers to it?
I don't know.
It was like 55, 47.
I don't know. Probably, maybe. Could be, I don't know.
And it kind of died in committee. So a lot of these things, are brought up in committee and they die.
Well, yeah, but you know what? The other thing is, and you may be right about that, but the other thing is sometimes things that might sound good, they may be too far-reaching or broad, and thus they are unconstitutional. And so until you really, and I don't know if this is the case there, but when you're dealing with the First Amendment and political speech, there is a long line of jurisprudence which says what you can do, what you can't do, what the criteria is, and so you need to fit it within those confines. And as is the case with a lot of proposed statutory law. Sometimes when it doesn't see the light of day past committee, it's because there's constitutional issues related to it. Sometimes it's because it's political opposition, but sometimes things that sound good don't pass constitutional muster.
So it's 7:30. One last quick question.
That's fine. All right.
Last question of the evening goes to this lady. I'll come into your aisle here.
My staff gets a lot of emails.
Hi,
I don't
I'm
get
sure.
many.
Hi, I'm Erin Johnson, and my question is about education. Public education is the backbone of our country.
Yes, it
Most
is.
people in this country get public education, and what I'm seeing at the local level, my local school district is Lebanon City, is I see teachers working really hard. I see a school board working together to balance a budget. They had to balance a budget, but they didn't know what kind of money they were going to have because the state budget was not balanced. Now, I realize that you don't have control over that, but some of the funding that Lebanon City specifically needs are federal programs, and I have a concern that our current that basically Betsy DeVos is going to start cutting these things. These are programs that are so necessary, and the reason why they are necessary is because if children do not get a good education, they will not be able to fill these technical jobs that are coming down the road. I'm a scientist, and I see them coming, and even kids who are getting high school diplomas, who are not necessarily going on to secondary education, they need to have a strong technical background. They can't do it if they don't have a good school lunch, and I want to know
a school breakfast.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to know what you are going to do to make sure that these services are going to be provided for children, because otherwise we're not going to be able to fulfill tomorrow's jobs.
What I'm going to do is be your voice for the precise set of values that you just laid out. I went to public school. I believe very strongly in public education. It is the equalizer in our democracy in terms of providing educational opportunity. You can't do things from a policy perspective that erodes the investment that we've made in public education. And when you're talking about a school lunch program, or even in some cases a school breakfast program, a child whose parents literally cannot afford to provide them those meals is a child who's going to go to school hungry and literally, physiologically, is not capable of learning because they don't have a sufficient amount of nutrition in them. So I am someone who speaks up for the school lunch program. I am someone who thinks that we need to make sure that we don't erode that investment in public education by allowing it to be siphoned off into other, cyber charter schools or whatever else. What the Secretary of Education may or may not propose, I'm going to wait till they whether they do or don't propose it. I have issued a letter disagreeing with a particular policy that she was going to change the guidance on something. I won't get in the weeds with it, but I speak out when I disagree with what's being proposed. It's really just as simple as that. And I try and be really clear on what I support, what I stand for, and what my values are. That's why, somebody asked me about Charlottesville. I said where I thought the president missed the mark on there, but I also laid out what I think the political culture is in our country and what we need to restore. A sense of decency and dignity to our political discourse, because I think it's also important for you all to know what my value system is and how I think, so that when you hear that something might get done, I may not have heard it yet, but if you know that I'm willing to speak out when I disagree with the president, or I disagree with Speaker Ryan, or I disagree with Nancy Pelosi or what the Democrats are proposing, I promise you it's going to come from a place of honesty. Doesn't mean you're going to agree with what I think, but I'm going to tell you what I think. And so I can't predict what she may or may not do, but you can go back and look at my voting record on issues related to public education, and I'm pretty darn strong. So, and if you look at me, I mean, I may not be all that strong, right? Sort of skinny. But, so thank you all for being here tonight. Just to remind you, I did a couple other town halls. They are available online if you want to see them. We'll do our best to make those questions in our e-newsletter polls better. What else did I want to say? Town halls, e-newsletter. Casework. Whether it's you or your neighbor, whether it's VA, immigration, passport, IRS, my office is there to help you. And so if something doesn't seem right in the wheels of government, even if it's not at the federal level, my folks are so good they can tell you where you have to go to get it. Now we're going to look at what you raised. But that's always a good message to end on, because the more you know about what we're capable of doing, the more you can help your friends and neighbors get the help they might need. That's what we're there to do. I also want to thank my staff. Took them a lot of time to, believe it or not, there's a lot of preparation that goes into the logistics of this. And I also want to thank the media for being here. Your willingness to come here, and then whatever I say, hopefully you write good stuff, but even if you don't, to get that out in the community is also very much appreciated by me and by my staff. So thank you all for being here this evening. I really appreciate your time.